Lesson 18.3, Task 1. Use the quadratic formula to solve equations. All right, in previous lessons, we have learned how to solve quadratics using graphing, using factoring, and completing the square. Now we're going to learn a fourth method, which is the quadratic formula. All right, so to get started, we're going to derive the quadratic formula, which is one of our state standards. And it says, previously you learned how to solve a literal equation for a specific variable. Remember, a literal equation is just an equation with lots of variables, and you solve for a specific variable. You can use completing the square to solve the general quadratic equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 for x. The resulting formula, called the quadratic formula, can be used to find the solutions of any quadratic equation. All right, so this is the method that will work for any quadratic equation. All right, so the quadratic formula for any quadratic equation of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a is not equal to 0. Remember, there has to be an a or it's not quadratic. Okay, and it has to be in standard form. It has to be set equal to 0 in order to use the quadratic formula. All right, to derive the quadratic formula, solve the general quadratic equation for x by completing the square. So write the general quadratic equation where a is not equal to 0. All right, so step 1, we're just starting with the general equation. All right, step 2, subtract the constant from both sides of the equation. All right, so remember when we did completing the square, we moved the constant to the other side so that we could add the perfect square needed in order to complete the square. All right, so that's step 2, subtract the constant. When I do that to both sides, this is the result. All right, step 3, multiply both sides of the equation by 4a. All right, so what I want to do is multiply this by something to make my coefficient of x squared a perfect square. So I'm going to multiply both sides of the equation by 4a. Now if you look, they multiplied the first term by 4a. 4a times a is 4a squared. X squared is still there. Multiply the next term by 4a. So bx times 4a is 4abx. And then we also have to multiply the other side of the equation by 4a as well. So we had negative c. 4a times negative c is the negative 4ac. All right, now when you multiply the whole equation by the same thing, this whole equation is just 4a times bigger than this, but they're still equivalent. All right, and again, the reason we did that is we need this first term to be a perfect square because we're trying to make this into a perfect square trinomial so that we can write it in factored form, and that's how we do completing the square. All right, so add b squared to both sides of the equation. So here I'm going to add b squared, and if I add b squared to the left, I'm going to do the same thing to the right. And the reason we're doing that is we want this side of the equation to be that perfect square trinomial. And if you remember, to complete the square, let's kind of go through that process here. All right, so what we're doing is completing the square by adding this term here to both sides so that this becomes a perfect square trinomial. So if you remember in the beginning, we took b, we halved it, and we squared it. That's what we did when we did completing the square. All right, but when a was not 1, then we had b squared over 4, and then we multiplied that times a. All right, so what we're going to do here is take b and square it. So in this case, b is 4ab. So we've got 4ab, and we're going to square it, and we're going to divide it by 4 times a. In this case, a is 4a squared. It's our term in front of our x squared. So 4a squared. All right, so if I simplify this, 4 squared is 16, a squared, b squared, over 16a squared. So what happens is my 16 and my a squared cancel, and that leaves b squared. So they did completing the square just like we did in the last lesson, and that's how they got the term. They wanted the perfect square so that then they can factor it. So this b squared came from this process right here that we used in the last lesson for completing the square. All right, once they do that, they have this side is a perfect square trinomial. They know it is because they use this process to make it that way. So then they can take this and write it in factored form. And again, remember it's just the square root of this term and then the square root of the last term, and then the middle term is built in. So if you want to check this step as well, you can do 2ax plus b, and this squared means this times itself. And basically you're just checking to make sure when they factor it, it does equal this, because it does look a little different with all the variables instead of just numbers. So the first term times the first term is 4a squared x squared, and then the first term times the last term would be plus 2abx, and then this term times the first term would be 2abx again, and then plus b times b is b squared. These are like terms, so we've got 4a squared x squared, and then 2 plus 2 is 4abx plus b squared. So you can see that this right here is this squared, which means this times itself. When you multiply it out, it does equal this step right here. So again, we're just justifying what they're doing. All right, once you factor it, you've got a binomial squared, which means you can take the square root of both sides to get rid of that squared term. When you take the square root of the left, the square root cancels the squared term and leaves 2ax plus b. And when you take the square root of the right side, remember you're going to have a plus or minus square root. And everything will go under that square root sign because it was all there before you took the square root. All right, then in the next step it says, we're still solving for x, remember, so you got to subtract b. Subtract b from the left, it disappears, and it moves to a negative b on the right side. All right, now the next thing is we're solving for x. The last step, this is multiplication, so I'm going to divide. Division undoes multiplication, so divide both sides by 2a, and that results in x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And that is the quadratic formula. And so that came from taking the standard quadratic equation and completing the square to solve for x. All right, now let's see if we can answer these questions based on the quadratic formula. So it says choose the phrase to explain why the second step is to rewrite ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 as ax squared plus bx equals negative c. All right, so the first step in solving an equation by completing the square. Remember, we had to move the constant term out of the way so that we could find that perfect square to go there. Choose the phrase to explain why you multiply all terms of a times x squared plus bx equals negative c by 4a. All right, so multiplying the terms by 4a makes the coefficient of x squared a perfect square. Again, and to factor it as a perfect square trinomial, we have to make sure the first term and the last term are perfect squares, and the middle is twice AB. All right, so choose the phrases to explain why you add b squared to both sides. All right, again, b squared, if you remember, I went through and found the b squared by completing the square like we did in the last lesson. So it'd be b squared over 4 times a, and when we simplify that, we got that step here. So b squared is the blank term needed to complete the square. B squared is the constant term needed to complete the square. The process by which this was determined is as follows. Square the coefficient of x. That's your middle term, remember. X is your middle term, your linear term, which was 4ac. And again, if I put this up here, you can see we did this here on the right-hand side. And then it says divide the result by 4 times the coefficient of the x squared term. So we divided it by 4a, which is your quadratic, which is the coefficient of the quadratic, and the x squared represents the quadratic term. All right, match each step with a property to justify it. So let's look at step 2. All right, step 2, subtract the constant from both sides of the equation. All right, that would be subtraction property. All right, I already have that one. Step 3, multiply both sides of the equation by 4a. That would be multiplication property. Step 4, and this is add b squared to both sides of the equation. Wish we didn't have to scroll up and down, but part of the process here. So we are going to have to do addition property. Now it says step 7, subtract b from both sides. Subtraction property. And step 8, divide both sides by 2a. That would be division property. All right, and so that's all there is. So it says in each of these steps, you are adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing by the same number. So all the properties of equality means that you're doing the same thing to both sides of the equation. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know.